Imagine you're stranded and isolated in the middle of Antarctica. It's cold, it's dark, and you're trapped. Imagine again there's an alien creature haunting the halls of the research station, and that it can rip through your clothes and assimilate you. Imagine one more time that any one of your companions could be the thing. You've no one to turn to, no one you can trust. It's just you against the abyss. Imagine the horror and the paranoia that would wash over you, the sheer terror. That's the dilemma the team at Outpost 31 find themselves in John Carpenter's 1982 horror masterpiece, The Thing. Today we are attempting to unravel one of the film's most suspenseful mysteries. Who was infected and when? We'll also examine a few other mysteries while we're at it. So, grab your flamethrower, get your blood test ready, and let's get started. And oh yeah, spoilers ahead. The film opens with a shot of a helicopter, just a speck in the sky at this point, flying over a rocky bridge. The music is low and ominous and foreboding. Soon it becomes clear they're chasing what appears to be an innocent-looking sled dog as it bounds across the snow-covered landscape. But why? We soon learn the crew is Norwegian, and first they try shooting at the dog, then dropping grenades onto it. Again, we are left to wonder why. Here's where we begin to get introduced to the US team. Our list of characters is helicopter pilot R.J. McReady, Kurt Russell, chief mechanic Childs, Keith David, biologist Blair, A. Wilford Brimley, physician Copper, Richard Dysart, station commander Gary, Donald Moffat, radio operator Windows, Thomas G. Waits, assistant mechanic / secondary helicopter pilot Palmer, David Clennon, meteorologist Bennings, Peter Maloney, assistant biologist Fuchs, Joel Pullis, geophysicist Norris, Charles Hallahan, cook Knowles, D.K. Carter, and dog handler Clark, Richard Masur. By the end of the film, several of these individuals will not only be dead, but infected. The dog enters the US camp, still being pursued by the helicopter. Several members of the US team rush out to see what the commotion is about. The chopper lands. The pilot and the passenger both exit the chopper. In the next shot, it is seen bounding up to Bennings. Meanwhile, the passenger prepares to chuck a grenade, fumbles it, blows himself up in the chopper instead. The pilot begins shouting at the Americans belligerently in Norwegian. The message he's trying to communicate: the dog is not what it seems. Here, you see the dog trying to lick Bennings' face. The pilot fires his rifle, hitting Bennings in the leg. Commander Gary shoots the pilot in an act of self-defense. Later, we see Clark with the dog as the others crowd around the wreckage of the chopper. Later, it becomes clear that Clark hasn't kennelled it yet. Later on in the movie, Mac and Copper leave for the Norwegian camp. The dog thing is left to infiltrate Outpost 31 and is seen roaming the corridors of the research station, before eventually heading inside the room of the man silhouetted against the wall. Before going any further, it's useful to discuss how the Thing operates and assimilates its victims. The assimilation process in the Thing is one of the film's most disturbing and fascinating mysteries, and while it's never fully explained, let's see what we can piece together from what's shown on screen. First, physical contact is the key. It's shown very clearly the Thing can assimilate a host by violently attacking and consuming its victim, as seen in the kennels, with Bennings, and even through the dirty long johns Knowles finds. What's not so clear is if it can infect victims with its cells. According to Fuchs, this is the case, which prompts him to tell Mac they should eat from cans, and that each man should prepare his own meals. It's interesting to note Blair comes to the same conclusion without being told. Proponents of the series suggest that some victims are assimilated without having their clothes destroyed, just through cell-to-cell contact. Curiously, when you see Blair program his simulation that tells him the Thing could take over the world in 27,000 hours, even on the computer it shows both methods of assimilation. First, you see the intruder cell assimilate one of the dog cells. This assimilated dog cell then throws out a tentacle to assimilate a second dog cell. So, we might be able to infer that an intruder cell is enough to infect another organism. That organism can then directly infect other organisms. Second, once it latches onto a host body, the Thing cells begin replicating and replacing the host cells. This isn't just mimicry, it's a total biological overwrite. The host is gradually transformed into a perfect imitation, down to the voice, mannerisms, and even physical quirks. Alongside this, the Thing seems to retain the host's memories and skills, allowing it to blend in seamlessly. Third, every part of the thing, even down to a drop of blood, is a living organism with a survival instinct. That's what Mac figures out when the Norris thing's head detaches itself from the body and makes a break for it before being torched. It's also why the blood test is so iconic. The blood itself reacts violently when threatened. The thing also prefers stealth over violence. While it can be grotesquely aggressive, the thing prefers stealth. Infecting someone quietly and letting their transformation happen unnoticed is far safer than a messy confrontation. Incidentally, this is something that does not happen in the kennel scene. Another interesting topic of contention is whether people know they're a thing once they've been taken over. According to John Carpenter in the Outpost 31 blog, he would assume people who have been infected know they're a thing. Later in the FAQs, he adds that someone that's been taken over knows they're an alien. The full quote is, "Yes, a thing is no longer the person that was being imitated. That person is dead, and an alien imposter is in its place. So there is no longer awareness coming from the human that once was for it to know or not know. Therefore, if you're sitting there wondering if you're a thing, you certainly aren't." That implies Norris, Palmer and Blair knew they were a thing once they'd been assimilated. Going back to the shadowy figure on the wall, the man's identity is unknown. In fact, the shadow doesn't belong to any of the actors. Instead, the shadow belongs to stuntman Dick Warlock. He actually played Michael Myers in 1981's Halloween 2. According to producer Stuart Cohen in the Outpost 31 blog, the shadow is meant to be that of Palmer.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
However, he and John Carpenter thought David Clennon's silhouette was too distinct. So, to throw viewers off the scent, they used Dick Warlock's. So, the first victim was definitely Palmer, right? Let me throw a few spanners in the works. First, we don't actually see the dog thing assimilate Palmer. Later on, Palmer acts very much like a human. He watches TV, still very much enjoys his weed, and even shares a split with Childs. And Childs remains human right up to the end of the film. We'll get to that. Is Palmer even the first victim? I have my doubts. My main point of contention is the fact that the silhouette doesn't look like Palmer's. It looks like Norris's. Just look at the protruding collar for one. Also, the silhouette appears to be wearing a turtleneck jumper, just like Norris's. Plus, if you look at Palmer's attire, he's clearly always wearing a denim jacket over his long johns. For me, this is strong evidence that Norris was the first to be assimilated, and it makes sense. Norris is the most unassuming of the group. Later, he turns down an offer from Gary to assume leadership. Again, perfect if you're trying not to stand out. Third point, when Norris, Palmer and McCready visit the spaceship crash site, Norris is the one to speculate the ship might have lain there for 100,000 years. Did he know? Some fans have wondered if Norris knew he was a thing, right up to the point he had his heart attack and collapsed. The way it's played implies he didn't, and that it's simply the thing's survival instincts kicking in when it attacks Copper. If the statement about assimilated persons knowing their thing is true, then Norris must have known, and the thing even copied his weak heart when it took him over. Bad luck for the thing, I guess. Another curious detail about Norris. In the scene where he's playing cards with Bennings, the latter is startled by the dog going under the table. However, Norris doesn't even flinch. Another possible indicator that he was the first to be infected. For now, and unless having the silhouette wear a collar and turtleneck jumper is a continuity error, I will assume Norris is the first to be assimilated. But who was next? Before we dive into that, I want to get into whether part of the dog thing survived incineration in the kennels, as I've seen a lot of debate raging on online about this. Let's lay out a timeline. Mac and Copper visit the Norwegian camp. They find a malformed humanoid thing called Splitface. Mac and Copper bring the thing back from the Norwegian camp. In between, Norris gets assimilated. Blair does his autopsy on the creature. Clark finally kennels the dog thing, which then promptly begins to assimilate the other dogs, which start barking, howling, trying to escape. Clark discovers what's going on. Mac sounds the alarm. Folks come rushing in, Gary and Norris among them. Mac sends Bennings to get Childs with a flamethrower. The team starts shooting up the kennel, killing some of the dogs in mid-assimilation. At one point, the thing grows two grotesquely clawed hands that reach for the ceiling and break some of the boards. Then the rest of the arachnid-type thing starts crawling up to the ceiling. So he does escape, right? Not so fast. Childs comes in with the flamethrower, burns the thing to a crisp. You see something fall to the ground. It looks like it could be the arachnid-type creature, although admittedly it's not very clear. You next see Blair carry out an autopsy on it, even breaking off one of the arachnid's spindly legs. Also, if it had escaped, I'm sure it would have been mentioned. So, I believe they did get the whole thing. Pun the pun. The next two characters to be infected are Palmer and Bennings. When Bennings was assimilated is easier to determine, as we see it happen on screen. Shortly after the autopsy scene, Mac, Norris and Palmer visit the alien spaceship. At this point, we speculated that Norris has been infected. We've already discussed how Norris believes the craft to be 100,000 years old, and he also has a very happy look on his face. We'll talk about Palmer in more detail in a bit, but for now he just hangs around in the background while Mac and Norris go down to the craft. At this point, Knowles interrupts the discussion among the crew to reveal he's found some dirty drawers in the kitchen trash. The implication is the thing infected someone off screen and tried to dispose of the clothes left behind. Next, we see Bennings, Windows and Mac clearing out the storeroom. At one point, Mac goes to talk with Fuchs, leaving Windows and Bennings alone. At one point, Bennings asks Windows to get the keys from Gary. When he returns, he's horrified to see Bennings in mid-assimilation. There's no mystery how it happened. Spike's face wasn't as dead as they thought. As soon as Windows left the room, it attacked Bennings. The distraught Windows rushes off to alert Mac and Fuchs, dropping the keys in the process. There's a clear audio cue, which means this is a key moment, no pun intended, that we're meant to keep in mind. We'll come back to it in a moment. When they return, they find the room empty. The bedding things has vanished, and the shattered window offers the only clue. The team scrambles outside, only to spot Bennings mid-transformation. Distorted and incomplete, the bedding things lets out an inhuman howl before they douse it in flames. Let's talk more about Palmer. A lot of folks speculate that he was assimilated by the part of the dog thing that escaped the kennel. However, as I pointed out, I don't think any part of the dog thing escaped the kennel. If not then, when? Norris could have infected Palmer in between the dissection of the kennel thing and Blair talking to the team about it. Neither he nor Norris is present for the former, but they appear side by side in the latter. Could this be a sign they're both infected? Another possible window is the transition between day 1 and day 2, when he, Norris and Mac head to the Norwegian camp. Some might argue, if Palmer and Norris are both things at this point, why don't they attack Mac? However, even if Palmer was a thing at this point, the likelihood of him or Norris attacking Mac at the crash site is slim. To assimilate Mac, they'd potentially have to tear through his clothes. And how would they explain that? It would be too suspicious. Plus, the creature wants to hide, and would only fight when it needs to. Palmer could also have been infected between returning from the Norwegian camp and the debriefing in the rec room. However, I'm not sure how much time has passed. Probably not a lot. However, if Palmer was indeed infected during any of these time frames I've just rattled off, it would explain the long johns Knowles finds. In fact, 5 characters are shown on camera to use the same long johns: Palmer, Copper, Knowles and Blair. Given that Knowles, Copper and Mac all passed the blood test, and given Blair's level of distress at this point, indicating he's still human, some fans speculate it can only be Palmer. There is a deleted scene in which the size of the long johns is given as a large. Most members of the team are revealed to be large, so that doesn't help much. However, given that we don't know Norris even wears a long john, it's very possible it belongs to Palmer. He does act very human in the rec room, but this could be a ruse by the thing. So, when was Palmer most likely assimilated? He was probably anywhere between sharing the joint with Childs and the rec room debriefing, which would explain the long johns. Almost certainly, by the time that evidence has been planted against Mac, Palmer has been assimilated. In fact, he seems really eager to have Mac killed in this scene, almost as if he knows he presents a clear and present danger. Let's go back to the keys for a second. As we said, Windows audibly dropped the keys when he saw the half-assimilated Bennings. Fast forward to Blair's meltdown and you can see Gary has them on his belt. In between, the keys remain on the floor for an inordinate amount of time. Someone seems to have used them to get to the blood supplies. One suspect that fans have pointed to is Bennings. However, the timeline doesn't seem to add up. First, he smashes through the window onto the snow. Second, his arms are still malformed, so he probably couldn't have handled the keys. Third, the team follows him and burned him right there in the snow. Also, there is no mention of their retrieving any keys. Whoever got the keys must have done so perhaps when everyone else was busy with Bennings. Certainly, the keys were back with Gary by the time of Blair's meltdown. So, whoever replaced the keys after opening the container with the bloods might have done so without arousing suspicion. I suspect it was a Norris thing that got the keys from the floor. Maybe Palmer if he had been assimilated by this point. Another point of contention is when exactly the bloods were sabotaged. We know the keys were most likely picked up either by Palmer or Norris early on. However, who actually sabotaged the bloods? When the team gets to them, the blood is still dripping, so it looks like the act of sabotage happened quite recently. Let's lay out a timeline. Childs, Mac, Gary, Clark and others get into the altercation with Blair after his meltdown. They lock him up. They then go outside to discuss a blood serum test. Later, they march inside and discover the dripping, sabotaged blood samples. Now, Norris has been with them this entire time. Who hasn't? Palmer. When he joins them in this particular scene, you can see he's been suspiciously quiet and hangs back, not saying much. Could he have been the one sabotaging the bloods while the whole thing with Blair was going down? The one spanner in the works is the fact that this happens after Gary gets his keys back. I think realistically the sabotage would have had to have happened shortly after the thing took the keys. Then put them back as soon as possible so no one would know they were missing. If true, then there's little chance of the blood looking as visceral as it does, meaning the filmmakers used a dramatic license. After all that, however, I am willing to give the filmmakers a little creative license and go along with the implication that the bloods were sabotaged recently, and that Palmer was the one to do it, since Norris was otherwise engaged. One interesting thing to note is when they inspect the destroyed blood samples, no one seems to remember Windows borrowing the keys from Gary. Nor does Windows admit to it either. It's all a bit odd, but with tempers fraying, I guess no one is thinking 100% straight, which makes the unraveling of trust and identity all the more intense as the thing infiltrates the group. Next we have Blair, and again the timeline is sketchy as to when he might have been assimilated. Let's look at the possibilities. Theory number 1 posits he was human all the way to his sabotaging of the vehicles, the killing of the sled dogs, and the destruction of the radio to prevent escape. Under this theory, Blair carried out all the above to prevent the thing from escaping the outpost, as he knew from his computer simulation how quickly it could absorb the entire world. However, producer Stuart Cohen believes he was probably assimilated somewhere between the autopsy on the splice face thing and his freak out in the radio room. In fact, when he's performing the autopsy on the dog thing, he uses the pencil to touch areas of the thing and even puts it up to his chin at one point. However, John Carpenter himself has apparently poured water on his theory, saying putting the pencil to his face wouldn't have been enough to infect him. In fact, the act of putting the pencil to his chin wasn't planned. Even after that, Cohen and Carpenter admit they don't know, or claim not to know, exactly when each character was assimilated. For me, a direct attack will hold up in the tool shed either by Palmer or Norris seems to be the most plausible. I believe when he tells Mac he's all better, he's already a thing. Not too long before, he was paranoid and erratic and even seemed to contemplate taking his own life. Now he's calm and relaxed? Sounds a bit suspect to me. Again, I posit he was turned between. He's been locked up in the tool shed and he's telling Mac he's feeling just fine and dandy. More evidence is revealed about him being a thing when they discover the mini spaceship he's been building for himself. Another possible indicator that could pinpoint when Blair is assimilated comes when he's first locked in the tool shed. He tells Mac to watch out for Clark. He's just trying to throw Mac off his scent, you may think. However, earlier in the movie, Blair is obviously already suspicious of Clark, and this is when they're in the kennel alone shortly after the kennel thing incident. This could indicate he's human up to the point he's locked up. Regarding Blair again, when he reveals himself to be the final thing, a horribly mutated dog comes out of him. This lends a little credence to those that believe part of the dog thing escaped during the kennel scene and might have infected Blair at one point. Or, as others have speculated, he might have become infected when carrying out the autopsy on the kennel thing. In another deleted scene, again, due as canon, I know, he mentions it's still alive. Could it have attacked him off screen? If so, it might explain why the dog thing comes out of him at the end. It could also imply his meltdown was an act to get himself locked up so he could scavenge for parts for his spaceship undisturbed. We tried to put together a timeline of when Norris, Palmer and Blair were likely infected and assimilated. Now it's time to take a look at the fates of the other team members. Let's start with Windows. One of the film's most iconic scenes is the blood test, which is administered by an ever-increasing paranoid McRaby. Here we learn that Palmer is indeed one of the infected, revealing his true form in a terrifying transformation. Here we have to mention the fan speculation that posits that characters who are humans have a gleam in their eye and those who are things do not. According to director of photography Dean Cudley, this only applies to the blood test scene, and you can tell because Palmer's eyes are veiled in shadow during the scene and has a little scoff/smirk just before he is revealed. Palmer in turn attacks and infects Windows. In another on-screen infection, Gary starts to become a thing when he's attacked and dragged away by the Blair thing in the tunnels near the end of the film. What about the rest of the gang? Let's start with Knowles. The erstwhile cook is in the tunnels helping Mac and Gary. He hears a sound. Gary being dragged away by Blair maybe, and is never heard or seen again. He simply disappears into the darkness. Apparently the original plan was to have a scene in which Knowles is assimilated, but Carpenter ran out of time and money. Copper is not assimilated in the film either. He is, however, brutally killed by the Norris thing when it sprouts monstrous teeth from its belly as Copper tries to use the defibrillator, tearing the doctor's arms off. The head of the Norris thing detaches from the rest of the body, becoming a grotesque mutated spider, prompting the famous line from Palmer.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Ironic, since he too is a thing now. Fuchs is an interesting one. Someone seemingly stalks by him in the lab as he looks over his notes after the power cuts out. We don't know who the person stalking the corridor is, as he's never shown. However, we can speculate. First, an audio cue plays as a shadowy figure stalks by the door.
Who's that?
The same audio cue plays when Blair attacks Gary in the tunnels. This leads me to believe the shadowy figure is Blair. Far from being contained, he's been wandering around the camp scavenging parts for his spaceship. Fuchs ends up running into the night and seemingly tortures himself, perhaps to avoid being infected by the Blair thing. Talking about Fuchs, he's the one who discovers Mac's destroyed rags, pointing the finger of suspicion at the helicopter pilot. This might have influenced his idea to flee and finally take his own life. Of course, we know from the blood test seen later that Mac is human, so obviously somebody planted the evidence. But who? My guess is the Blair thing, as we know he's been running around the camp to scavenge for parts and, in my opinion, is a shadowy figure that passes Fuchs in the darkened lab because of the aforementioned audio cue. This causes Fuchs to head outside where he conveniently finds Mac's tattered rags. Last but not least, we have poor Clark, who's actually human, although mysteriously absent through some parts of the film. A red herring, if you will. He is killed by Mac when the former comes at him with a knife just before the blood test scene. That just leaves Childs and Mac, the only two characters left standing at the end of the film. And we're meant to doubt whether Childs is infected, as he disappears after being left on guard, while Mac, Gary and Knowles go out to test Blair. The ambiguous ending of John Carpenter's The Thing has sparked countless theories. A popular interpretation centers on the bottle of scotch that Mac hands him. Earlier, Mac had crafted Molotov cocktails using scotch bottles, leading some to suggest that this one contains gasoline. According to this theory, the Thing, unfamiliar with alcohol, wouldn't recognize the difference and drinks it, whereas a human like Childs would have spit it out. There are other apparent clues that point to Childs being a Thing. First, he doesn't have a gleam in his eye. Second, he doesn't have condensation. Let's go through these one by one. First, the gasoline bottles were green and were actually destroyed by the Blair Thing in the final fight. The one Mac is holding, the one he's been seemingly drinking from the whole film, is dark green with the label still on it. So I don't think Mac gave Childs gasoline. Also, if you look closely, Childs has both condensation and a slight gleam in his eye. It's just not very noticeable because Childs is in the dark while Mac is facing the fires. That doesn't mean there aren't any clues that point to Childs being a Thing. In one shot of him standing guard by the door, there's a blue coat hanging on the wall. Later, Carpenter shows us a panning shot of the corridor. Now the door is open and the coat is gone. The implication is that the Blair Thing attacked and assimilated Childs and ripped through the coat, meaning he needed a new one. Even his explanation that he saw Blair and tried to chase him doesn't make much sense. However, an even later shot, when Mac, Knowles and Gary are going down into the generator room, seems to reveal the coat is back on the hook. So, it could be ascribed to a continuity error, as the positions of the coats seem to change between shots. Plus, I think Childs is wearing the same clothes at the end, just very frosted over. My 2 cents is that Childs is human at the end, just like Mac. The film thus ends on a nihilistic note, as the characters realize they'll probably freeze to death when the fires die out. However, even if he is a Thing, there's no need to kill Mac, as he could just wait for him to freeze to death while he goes into a cryogenic sleep. A couple of other points. There was an alternate ending to The Thing that featured Mac in a more definitive scenario inside a warm office taking a blood test to prove he's human. This version was shot at the insistence of editor Tom Ramsey, who was concerned that the ambiguous original ending might not sit well with test audiences. In this alternative scene, Mac is rescued and taken to another research station. There, he calmly submits to a second blood test, which confirms he's not infected. It was meant to give viewers some closure. However, Carpenter ultimately rejected it, feeling it undercuts the film's core theme of paranoia and uncertainty. Second, the 2011 game, which Carpenter considers canon, Child dies of apparent hypothermia, and Mac is found to be alive and well. and most importantly, human. Make of that what you will. The Thing masterfully keeps us guessing until the very end. The uncertainty and paranoia make it a timeless horror classic. But who do you guys think was infected when? And why? Was Childs human? What about the other mysteries we discussed? The keys, the blood samples? Drop your theories in the comments below. And thank you for joining us on this journey through Outpost 31. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more in-depth movie analysis like this one. Until next time, take care. Bye for now.